Welcome back to another episode of Hope for Your Life, where we believe there's always hope, no matter what situation you're in. Today, I want to talk to you about how do we resolve guilt? How do we resolve guilt? And we're going to do this in two parts. This is going to be the first part of this series on how to resolve guilt. You know, guilt is something that plagues a lot of people, and many people don't realize how destructive guilt can be. But guilt, like depression, like anxiety, like stress, can wreak havoc on our overall health. So how do we resolve guilt? Many people walk around with chronic guilt and don't understand how much it's crippling them in life. So let's talk about it. First of all, I want you to know that there is legitimate guilt. We can call it natural guilt. And there's illegitimate guilt or toxic guilt. What is natural guilt or legitimate guilt? Natural guilt is something that is a primal human emotion, and it serves a purpose. It's functional. Okay, we're going to talk more about natural guilt in the next episode. But think of it like a fire alarm. If a fire alarm is working properly, it is going to detect a fire that may be starting or may be present if enough smoke reaches it that gives evidence that there may be a fire present. So that fire alarm is supposed to sound off, right? If something's burning on the stove and it's generating enough smoke that detector says, hey, there may be a fire present, it's going to sound the alarm. And that's a good thing because you want to get to that before it really turns into something big. Well, that's how legitimate guilt works. It sounds off when we are in conflict with our values or with universal ethics like fairness and just respecting the rights and lives of other people and our own, right? So that's legitimate guilt. And so if you steal someone's property or if you cheat on your spouse, it's perfectly legitimate and natural to feel guilt. And again, the purpose is to move you back toward being in alignment and in sync with your values, right? But what about illegitimate guilt? Let's talk about that. And just think about illegitimate guilt, going back to that fire alarm illustration. When that fire alarm is working properly, as we said, if there's enough smoke to suggest that there could be a fire starting or present, that alarm is going to go off appropriately, right? But just imagine if the alarm is going off every time you turn the stove on, or every time the microwave is running, or every time you walk past and generate enough breeze just to set off the fire alarm. Well, that's a dysfunctional alarm. You can't live like that. Every second, the alarm is going to be going off, right? So that's what illegitimate guilt is like. It's like that dysfunctional fire alarm. So I'm going to talk to you about 3 forms of illegitimate guilt that we want to take off of our plate. Is undue, unnecessary guilt and stress in our lives. All right, the first one I'm going to call secondhand guilt. And I'm sure there are scientific terms for these, but I'm calling it secondhand guilt. And that's when the source of our guilt is someone else's convictions, right? Remember we said that legitimate guilt arises when you find yourself in conflict with your value system or with universal principles that just deal with human decency, right? Not because you find yourself in conflict with other people's standards or you're measuring your life to other people's standards. That's secondhand guilt. That's illegitimate guilt. Let me give you a couple of examples. If you belong to a group or an association, it could be religious, social, professional, there are shared values, right? There are corporate values. Now, if you embrace those values and you accept them as part of your internal value system, then it's normal and natural for you to feel guilt when you are in violation of those values because they are now your values, right? But if you find yourself constantly feeling guilty about things that are not your convictions, then you need to think about whether or not your personal beliefs and values really align with the group's. And then you may need to ask that serious question of whether or not you really should belong to that group. That's going to be the solution there. Another example, which we all kind of run into sometimes when you're on your social media, you're on Instagram or Facebook or whatever, and you see a lot of people promoting or sharing health advice or financial advice or business advice, and it all sounds really great. If you start to feel guilty because you're not measuring up to whatever their standard is that they're promoting, or what they're saying is the ultimate truth about a financial principle or what have you, that's secondhand guilt. That's not necessarily legitimate guilt. The proper response, and maybe the solution for that kind of guilt, is if you're stimulated to explore one of those ideas and see if that's something that you want to put into practice or that you want to adopt as part of your financial strategy or your health program, great. That may be an appropriate response rather than saying, oh, they've got the right idea, I don't have it, and therefore you feel guilty. That's secondhand guilt. We want to offload that, take that off of our stress plate, because it's just not necessary to carry that weight around. Okay? Here's another form of illegitimate guilt. I call it inherited guilt. Inherited guilt. And the source of that guilt oftentimes comes from guilt that's been, or seeds that have been implanted in us from our upbringing. So if you grew up in an overly critical home where everything that you did was criticized, or you grew up in a home where conflict was regularly resolved by blaming and being involved in the blame game and talking about who did this wrong and who did that wrong. If you grew up in that kind of atmosphere, then you can inherit that kind of guilt complex where you always feel responsible and guilty about anything that goes wrong in your life or around you, right? It may not even have anything to do with what you've done, but you just have this guilty feeling, right? Or this guilt complex. You're just prone to that. And that's, again, because seeds have been planted and watered, and now you begin to think the way that you've been conditioned to think, right? So again, we have to first of all recognize that that is not legitimate guilt. That's something we can take off of our plate. And then you may have to embark on a healing journey, whether it's a self-help kind of journey where you're reading a lot of information that helps to deprogram that kind of thinking, or it may even involve therapy, where you are in a program that is helping to pull you out of that mindset, right? So inherited guilt, another form of illegitimate guilt that we don't need. We need to take that off of our plate. And as we deal with these forms of guilt and remove them, we can just feel the stress load lightening. That's what we want to do. We want to get that undue stress out of our lives and off of our heads, right? So the last one I want to talk to you about, I'm going to call it personality-driven guilt. Personality-driven guilt. And that's when the source of your guilt can be found in your own personality. You know, some of us are perfectionists. You know, everything has to be right. Every T has to be crossed, every I dotted, everything precise, everything flawless. We can't make a move until everything is lined up, right? I know I have that tendency sometimes, and some of us just have that to an extreme, right? And when we think like that, a lot of times we can wind up with guilt because we didn't do this perfectly. We didn't do this totally, right? For our melancholy people out there where we tend to exaggerate the negative, or we're looking around every corner for what's going to happen that's not good, we can kind of live with guilt too. We take on responsibility for things that we really can't control, and we feel some sense of guilt for it. Those are personality-driven guilt. And we need to be aware of that. You know, how do we deal with that? Be honest with yourself. Recognize that there are strengths and weaknesses in every personality, right? And just be honest with yourself. Ask yourself the question, am I taking on unreasonable expectations right now? Is that the source of my guilt at this moment? Or am I taking on responsibility for things that I really can't control? Is that what's causing me to feel this sense of guilt right now? Just really be honest with yourself. And that's how you can help deal with that personality-driven guilt. Know who you are and recognize what your strengths are, where sometimes those weaknesses can get you and pull you into a guilt complex. So again, we talked about the difference between legitimate and illegitimate guilt. We want to get rid of those illegitimate guilt complexes. They don't need to be on your plate. Okay? And in the next episode, we're going to deal with natural or legitimate guilt. How do we resolve guilt that's really supposed to be there, like that fire alarm? Okay? So until next time, listen, we want you, if you drop by, subscribe to this YouTube channel, click that notification bell so that you can be alerted when the next episode is coming. And if you have a topic that you would like us to discuss, you'd like us to deal with, you can submit that in the comment section and we'll do our best to get to that topic. Until next time, we'll see you. And remember, there's always hope, no matter what situation you're in.